welcome to Cover Story. This week, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi packs his bags for the United States, we take a look at not just Modi's international charm offensive, but also the role various Indian Prime Ministers have played in the past vis-a-vis American presidents. Our checklist spans the decades from Nehru to Modi as we try and ascertain how much of a role personal chemistry has in international rapport. As in all relations, chemistry plays an important role in international bilaterals as well. Admittedly, national issues are crucial, but it is the rapport between the heads of state that can add that extra zing, or in some case, the extra string, to a bilateral equation between two countries. Take the case of USA. Both Nehru and his daughter Indira failed to make a personal connect with the then American presidents. Rajiv tried to thaw the Cold War, but it was really during Vajpayee's time that the ice was visibly broken.
Personality is important in foreign relations. If two people loathe each other on sight, it's unlikely that they'll come to any kind of agreement. But too much is often made of personality. There's the famous story that Rajiv Gandhi once provided in an interview. He was talking to Benazir Bhutto, and she said to him that, you know, I am young, you are young, we're a new generation of leaders. Our parents met, they came to some kind of conclusion, we'll do the same. And he looked at her quite sternly and he said, Benazir, I am young, you're young, our parents knew each other. But if you think that I'm going to sacrifice the interests of the Indian people only because we're pals, think again.
And I've seen lots of personal equations, but to be quite honest, the so-called Nehru-Gandhi inability to get on with Americans was not personal. They had very good personal relations. I mean, Eisenhower's visit here was a roaring success. Yes, Nixon was very difficult and we had problems with other individuals. But I don't think we should personalize these things. The fact of the matter is that we had problems of national interest at that time. The Cold War brought some around. But the real problem was that, you know, we keep forgetting that India and America never had anything to do with each other till India became independent.
Nehru visited United States 3 times. During his first visit, he was welcomed by President Eisenhower, who also had a successful Indian tour. But it was the Nehru-Kennedy meet in 1961 that created the most buzz. The choreography was perfect. The Kennedys welcomed Nehru and his daughter Indira at the airport in Newport, and they all flew to Washington together. But as Jackie Kennedy revealed in an interview later, her husband had called it the worst visit of a head of state. But of course, this was before the Indira-Nixon meeting.
You know, Kennedy was part of a generation that had idealized and idolized Nehru. And when Nehru came to the US, he thought this was a great opportunity. And there were various meetings arranged for Nehru with intellectuals, with officials. And through it all, Nehru was uncooperative, he was tired, he would stumble into meetings, he would sort of fall down softly, more or less, into his chair, look around very tired, be irritable. And Kennedy said afterwards, according to all the memoirs written by his aides, that he'd never been more disappointed in his life. So sometimes it's difficult as an old man to live up to people's image of what you were when you were younger.
You might recall that B.K. Nehru himself has recorded that when Kennedy met, Kennedy went out of the way on being very warm to Nehru because he thought he's a world statesman and he wanted to talk to him all that. But then, according to B.K. Nehru, Panditji just did not respond at all. In fact, whatever he was asking, he was just being very vague and he was sort of restless and he wouldn't answer, that kind of thing.
This is not to say that Nehru turned off his charm completely during the visit. He accessorized the trip with the requisite fluff, visiting Disneyland where he rode in an electric car with Walt Disney and played to the gallery at the Washington Press Club.
The acknowledged leader of the neutralist bloc.
I must say, it is a slightly intimidating experience to meet so many of members of the press whose words not only go across the United States but to all parts of the world.
What is your opinion of the continued nuclear blasting by the USSR?
Well, the answer is there is no neutralist bloc. Secondly, I'm not the leader of anybody. If you like, my people have done me the honor of putting me in a very responsible position in India, so I can claim to speak on behalf of India, but not on behalf of any other country. I don't presume to be leader of any other, and I have no desire to be leader of any other country. My desire is to cooperate with them, certainly try to influence them sometimes according to my thinking. As for the resumption of nuclear tests by the Soviet Union, I have often stated that I have thought it a very harmful, disastrous thing.
After Nehru's death and when Indira Gandhi came on the scene, and India gradually shifted toward the Soviet camp, the relation between India and US became cold and hostile to a certain extent during President Nixon's era. So then there was a lull for a very long time between the personal relationship between the Indian Prime Minister and the US President, till the Janata Party came on the scene and Morarji became the Prime Minister. Morarji was known to be pro-America, and therefore the Americans were very keen to build up on this relationship. He became the Prime Minister. Morarji was known to be pro-America, and therefore the Americans were very keen to build up on this relationship, and President Jimmy Carter visited India during the brief Janata regime, and again Indo-US relations were in a very normal and cordial mode.
During the Cold War, India's rapport with Russia was always a factor in the Indo-US relations. While for its part, India has always been suspicious of American support to Pakistan. It was during Indira Gandhi's time that the relations plummeted to an all-time low, especially during the 1971 Indo-Pak War. Both Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger had cautioned Indira not to support the bid for East Pakistan. They were wooing General Yahya Khan to soften China towards the US. But more importantly, there was no personal chemistry between Indira and Nixon. As Kissinger said later, the blunt military chiefs of Pakistan were more congenial to Nixon than the complex and apparently haughty Brahmin leaders of India.
You know, one thing people always said about Indira Gandhi was that she could be awkward. If she was not at ease herself, she made no attempt to put you at ease. She could be distant, aloof, imperious. And similarly, people said about Nixon that he was not the world's most likable man. In fact, the anti-Nixon slogan in those days was, "Would you buy a used car from this man?" Because he's such a shifty character. And when Mrs. Gandhi and Nixon met, the meeting was a disaster. Kissinger writes in his memoir, The White House Years, that she admonished him in the manner of a school teacher speaking to a slightly backward child. This is Kissinger's own phrase. And Nixon hated her, completely hated her. And afterwards, he was always able to refer to her solely as the, well, in the words of the White House tapes, expletive deleted.
Indira Gandhi just did not get along with Nixon at all, nor did Nixon like Indira Gandhi. She hated her guts. And altogether, when she visited the United States on November 5th and 6th, 1971, and soon after, when she came back immediately afterwards, I think we had the Bangladesh liberation, within 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So he probably was not told about it, and he was very upset, and even otherwise he did not like her. So the next day, on the 5th, when he was having a private chat with Kissinger, his National Security Advisor, and also his Secretary of State, he abused her.
However, Indira's son Rajiv did try to thaw the Cold War between the two nations. His youthful charm, political pedigree, and Kennedy's credentials were on full display when he met the then President Ronald Reagan and his Vice President, the senior George Bush.
India is an old country, but a young nation. And like the young everywhere, we are impatient. I am young, and I too have a dream. I dream of an India strong, independent, self-reliant, and on the front rank of the nations of the world in the service of mankind. I am committed to realizing that dream through dedication, hard work, and the collective determination of our people.
One of the great tragedies, I suppose, is that Rajiv and George Bush, the first George Bush, didn't have more to do with each other. Because when Rajiv went to America and Reagan was president, Reagan was a slightly spaced out character who was only dimly aware where India was. He'd seen movies about tigers and that was about it. But Bush actually liked Rajiv. He took him as vice president to his ranch and they really got along incredibly well. And that was the real chemistry, and unfortunately we never had a chance to find out how that would have worked.
For Rajiv, although not seen as a very hostile Indian leader towards US, but his era could not be seen as something where we could say that there was relations were good or there was any personal chemistry. So we have to see the Indo-US relation in the context of 1991, because we started liberalization, globalization. At the same time there was end of the Cold War, and with all these developments, India was seen in the US in a different perspective. So therefore, post Cold War era, the relations started developing in a positive way, and that is where Narasimha Rao came on the scene. Although he was not a very powerful and charismatic Indian Prime Minister, but US started seeing India as a friendly country.
But Reagan, definitely during Reagan's time, and things began. Rajiv was very charming, and I think Carter really liked him, so that kind of thing. So that started the thing. But when Narasimha Rao ji came, it was again very not a very good chemistry at that time. But then in '94, he made a visit to the US. That was the first time when he met Clinton. So there was a lot of opposition even within this country. You know, BJP was opposing, left parties were opposing. They were saying, why was he going? Why should he go now? You know, that kind of opposition came. But still he went there. And then after the first meeting, the differences are narrowed down.
While Rajiv had the energy of youth, Atal Bihari Vajpayee brought to the negotiating table the gravitas of a seasoned campaigner. His words were more measured than spontaneous in his dealings with the then President Bill Clinton. But initially the relations got off on a rocky start, for there was the shadow of Pokhran II nuclear test by India in 1998.
But don't forget that Vajpayee went after Clinton's visit to India. It was Clinton's visit to India first, which took place. Of course, by the time a lot of things had changed, the negative impact of the sanctions and Pokhran II, but the fact remains that Clinton never expected this kind of warm reception in India. And having seen that, when Mr. Vajpayee went to US, perhaps he wanted to reciprocate something of that kind within the US constraints. And I think the best thing he could perhaps do was to host a very lavish dinner in his honor, which is not very common in the American context.
In fact, not only did Clinton's India visit establish a firm bond between him and Vajpayee, he also showcased to the Indian leadership the art of combining showmanship within the parameters of stiff foreign protocol. On a visit to the Naila village near Jaipur, he danced with the villagers, attended a panchayat meet and served dinner to school children. Incidentally, this village is 475 kilometers away from Pokhran.
I was there when Vajpayee went to meet Clinton, and Clinton threw this massive banquet for Vajpayee. It was so massive they couldn't actually fit it into one of the rooms at the White House. They erected a bloody great tent in the lawns of the White House, and we were all inside the tent. And it was also, though as Indians we didn't realize it then, an incredibly important event because it was the last state dinner of the Clinton presidency. And all of Washington and all of America, pretty much anybody who was anybody in America wanted to attend. So almost by default, those of us in the press party who got invited and Vajpayee and the delegation were part of history.
And when Mr. Vajpayee went to US, again, perhaps for the first time, any Indian Prime Minister was accorded a very warm, cordial and a very lavish reception. I think never in the history of since independence, any Indian Prime Minister has been given a dinner at White House In fact, the entire White House lawns were converted into a dining room with beautiful tents pitched up, and more than 2,000 Indians, American Indians, joining that dinner. It was a gala dinner, a lot of music, a lot of fun, and both Vajpayee and Clinton really enjoyed it. And I still remember Clinton's speech in which he said, well, half of India is here and half of India is waiting outside to get in to join this dinner.
Clinton's warmth and Vajpayee's hospitality got India and the US over the Pokhran blast. During one of their talks, Vajpayee is said to have joked to Clinton that while he took the bus to Lahore, the bus went to Kargil. And even today, a lot of Clinton's informal style during his India trip can be seen in the way Modi conducts his foreign relations. For at the end, it is not the choreographed moves but the spontaneous gestures that add the final icing on the global cake.
When both of them were addressing the media, since the Clinton is a very tall figure, so the lectern, the way it was fixed, could not be adjusted because of Vajpayee's height. And I still remember Clinton went up to a distance and picked up a stool kind of a wooden box and personally lifted and put it for Mr. Vajpayee to be comfortable. Now this is a very small gesture, but one can imagine the American president doing this kind of a gesture for the Indian Prime Minister.
You wouldn't think it to look at them because they're very different people, but Blair really liked Vajpayee. In fact, the British Prime Minister has a country home called Chequers, and he insisted, I was part of the press party at that stage, that Vajpayee come to Chequers to meet him. And Vajpayee walked in, and there was Blair in jeans and a t-shirt, picking up this small child who was mewling and puking. And Vajpayee was a rather formal man, was somewhat astonished by this show of familiarity that had been allowed into this house. But that's how Blair wanted to relate to Vajpayee. Before the visit, Blair's people called up Vajpayee's people and said this is an informal meeting and the two prime ministers are going to just chill out or relax. So is it okay if he calls him Tony? And they said, sure. And he'll of course refer to Vajpayee as Atal. And they said, that might be a bit of a problem. Can you try Atalji, please? So he called him Atalji.
Vajpayee was also the first to address the United Nations in Hindi. And although Modi has gone a step further and is now conducting all his global interactions in Hindi.
विकास के लिए राष्ट्रों के बीच शांति और लोकतंत्र की स्थापना आवश्यक है। शांति, लोकतंत्र और विकास एक दूसरे के पूरक हैं। ये खेद का विषय है कि विश्व की शांति और सुरक्षा के लिए परमाणु युद्ध का भय इस नई सदी में भी एक गंभीर खतरा बना हुआ है।
But Vajpayee, when he went to UN as External Affairs Minister in 77-78, he had spoken there in Hindi. And that was the first speech made by anyone at the UN in Hindi. And that was highly appreciated back home. So Vajpayee remembered that when he became the Prime Minister, he insisted that he must speak in Hindi. And although our Foreign Office was not very keen, they tried to explain to him, sir, it hardly makes any difference. Here nobody, in fact, listens to your speech. They all listen to the translations. But Vajpayee knew that this would send a very positive signal back home, and therefore he insisted, and he overruled the Indian Foreign Office and spoke in Hindi. And back home, the speech was covered live, and it really sent a very positive signal.
I think it's a great advantage. You know, one of the disadvantages that I think we have suffered from in our international relations is that because so many of us speak English, others think we are thinking like English. But we are a different people. I mean, when they deal with the Chinese, they know it's a different civilization, a different way of thinking. When they deal with us, they think they were dealing with the same cast of mind. So it's a great advantage to make it evident that no, we have different ways of thinking.
When you are having bilateral talks with the Chinese or the Japanese, they speak in their own language, and that is interpreted or translated into English for the benefit of the Indian Prime Minister. So Modi has made a departure. He said, okay, let the Chinese or the Japanese speak in their own language, but the interpreter should not translate into English for the benefit of the Indian Prime Minister. So they should translate the Japanese into Hindi and the Chinese into Hindi, and when he speaks in Hindi, it should be straight away translated into their language. So why bring in English in between?
Vajpayee's successor, Manmohan, had the added value of brand recall. The West already knew him as a great liberalizer much before he became Prime Minister. But it was not economic reforms but the nuclear deal that was a highlight of Indo-US relations in the Bush-Manmohan era.
Now, sometimes chemistry can mislead people. I remember the case of Manmohan Singh, who met George W. Bush, and George W. Bush's public image is this moron. But if you actually meet him face to face, he's not that stupid. He's got very good manners, he's witty, he's a conversationalist, and he's very much the typical southern gentleman. And he met Manmohan Singh, and he liked Manmohan Singh, and he flattered Manmohan Singh, he was polite to Manmohan Singh. And when Manmohan Singh came back to India, he was like a small child who had met Santa Claus for the first time at a department store and had been given a Singh, and he liked Manmohan Singh, and he flattered Manmohan Singh, he was polite to Manmohan Singh. And when Manmohan Singh came back to India, he was like a small child who had met Santa Claus for the first time at a department store and had been given a bag of sweets and believed it was now his duty to be nice to Santa. And that, unfortunately, was the tragedy of India-US relations in the Manmohan era.
In the case of Bush, I would say, frankly, he did all kinds of things that no Indian could ever approve of. But yet, oddly enough, he had this great devotion to building up relationship with India.
The personal bonhomie between Bush and Manmohan was there for all to see. In fact, the rapport had critics complaining that the Indian Prime Minister was going out of his way to accommodate the West.
In making all this happen, you have referred to our cooperation with regard to civil nuclear energy. I know these were difficult issues, and at each stage it was your leadership, your personal intervention which resolved all the difficulties that were affecting the progress of these negotiations.
One such sign of that relationship is the India-US civilian nuclear agreement. This has taken a lot of work on both our parts, a lot of courage on your part, and of course we want the agreement to satisfy you and get out of our Congress.
And now it is time for the Modi-Obama meet. For after the UN General Assembly session, the Indian Prime Minister is the only global leader to have been invited to Washington for a one-on-one meeting. Coming as it does after the US boycott of Modi, this meeting is significant. Hasn't the Modi-US relationship gone a long way? You know, first there was a boycott of Modi, and now there's actually a summit between Obama and Modi that's going to take place.
Well, I think people want to look forward, and they see Prime Minister Modi as having been elected in a very vibrant way by the world's largest democracy. We have an awful lot of things that we want to talk to him personally and India about. So I think it's a desire to look forward and really look at how to make this relationship one of the key ones that the United States has, and hopes very much that India sees it the same way.
I wouldn't pay too much attention to the so-called boycott. It's not a boycott. Every country has its own laws. We have had laws that have made us stop people from entering the country. In this case, of course, he's such a famous man and such a famous figure that this has become something of a notorious case.
With China and Japan not coughing up the entire sum of foreign investment needed to get India out of its current fiscal difficulties, Modi is expected to display all his marketing skills in showcasing India as the next best investment destination. What could also come up during the talks is the growth of ISIL and the recent visit of the Chinese president to India. With Prime Minister Modi, ISIS will come up.
I'm sure it will, because it's very much in the news and on the president's mind. And generally, I would like to say about President Obama that what he is dedicated to is finding partners with similar values to be able to work on issues of stability, safety, peace. President Xi Jinping will have been in India before the Prime Minister comes to the United States, and from my own understanding of how things work, I'm sure that the President will be interested in the Prime Minister's views on Xi Jinping and China generally.
When India has a foreign minister, why are prime ministers so obsessed with foreign policy? The India-US nuclear deal was seen as Manmohan Singh's initiative, not as the foreign ministry's initiative. Every single Prime Minister of India tries to put his stamp on India's foreign policy. And the short answer to that is that once you get into that office, you realize there's not that much you can do in India. Events tend to take their own course. So your best hope, therefore, is to become a foreign policy Prime Minister. And if you see all those visuals of yourself shaking hands with the President of America or the leader of China, you begin to think of yourself as a statesman. And you hope, somehow, that you hope to God, that the country thinks of you that way also. Which is why, even if there are foreign ministers or whatever, usually foreign policy becomes the Prime Minister's prerogative. Now, Modi is no exception. I think having been seen as a rather parochial leader in Gujarat, having been denied a visa by the Americans, he's now arrived at Racecourse Road and he says, guess what guys, I'm a statesman.
But definitely all eyes will be on Narendra Modi as he addresses the UN General Assembly meet. For the Indian Prime Minister has become quite the global fascination. But from us, that's all this week. Thank you for watching Cover Story, and we'll see you again same time next week.